The world Georgia Keane left behind in New York City was a cacophony of noise, ambition, and the suffocating expectations of a burgeoning art scene that sought to define her. They called her a modernist, a sensualist, a woman who painted flowers in a way that made people uncomfortable and intrigued in equal measure. But to Georgia, the city had become a cage, its towering skyscrapers blocking out the vast open sky her soul craved. She was tired of the critics, of the endless parties, of being a curiosity. She was an artist and she needed to breathe. So, in the summer of 1929, she had done the unthinkable. At the height of her rising fame, she had packed her canvases and her paints, boarded a train and traveled west, seeking a solitude so profound it was almost a myth. She found it in the stark, magnificent, and utterly empty landscape of northern New Mexico. She purchased a small, remote adobe ranch house, a simple, earthbound structure that seemed to have grown organically from the red desert soil. It was a place of brutal heat, of silence so deep it rang in your ears, and of a light so pure and so honest it stripped away all pretense. It was perfect. Here, her art was reborn. She abandoned the delicate, crowded, floral, still lifes that had made her famous and turned her eye to the new world around her. She painted the bleached white of animal skulls found on her long walks, the vibrant, impossible colors of the mesas at sunset, the stark, architectural beauty of an ancient, weathered door. Her work became bolder, stronger, more honest. She was not just painting a landscape, she was painting her own soul, finally free. Her life settled into a simple monastic routine. Rise at dawn, paint until the light failed, and spend her evenings in quiet contemplation under a vast, star-filled sky that felt like the ceiling of God's own cathedral. She had her work, her solitude, and the boundless, beautiful silence. It was everything she had ever wanted. This carefully constructed piece was shattered by a storm. It was not a gentle summer rain, but a violent, biblical tempest that seemed to burst from the heavens without warning. The sky turned a bruised, angry purple, and rain fell in blinding, horizontal sheets, turning the dry arroyos into raging, muddy rivers. Georgia stood at her window, watching the raw power of the storm, a thrill of primal fear and artistic awe running through her. The storm passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving the desert washed clean, the air smelling of wet sage and rich, red earth. It was on her walk the following morning, while assessing the storm's damage to a favorite patch of desert poppies, that she found him. He was lying at the bottom of a shallow, rock-strewn arroyo, half submerged in the muddy water, his body twisted at an unnatural angle. One of his legs was clearly broken, the bone protruding in a grotesque, shocking tear through his trousers. A deep gash on his forehead matted his dark hair with blood. He was unconscious, his face pale as death. Beside him, its front wheel mangled, was a wrecked Ford Model T, clearly swept off a nearby dirt road by the flash flood. Georgia's first instinct, born of a lifetime of cultivated solitude, was to turn and run, to pretend she had seen nothing. This was a man, a problem, a violent intrusion into her sacred, peaceful world. To help him would be to invite the chaos she had traveled 2,000 miles to escape. But her second instinct, the one that defined the true core of her character, was one of pure, unadorned humanity. He was a person, injured and alone, and she could not, in good conscience, leave him to die in the desert. With a strength she didn't know she possessed, she managed to drag him from the muddy water and up the slippery bank of the arroyo. He was a large man, heavy with muscle, and the effort left her breathless, her clothes caked in mud. She examined his injuries with a practical, steady hand. The leg was a terrible break, and the gash on his head was deep. He was burning with fever. He needed a doctor. But the nearest town, and its aging, often inebriated physician, was over 20 miles away, an impossible journey with a man in his condition. She was the only help he had. The process of getting him back to her small ranch house was a grueling, nightmarish ordeal. She half carried, half dragged his dead weight, her own small frame screaming in protest. She laid him on her own simple bed, The incongruous sight of this large, broken man in her Spartan feminine space, a shock to her senses. She worked with a focused, almost detached efficiency. She cleaned his wounds as best she could, her artist's steady hand surprisingly adept at the grim work. She managed to set his leg, a brutal, agonizing process that made sweat bead on her forehead, using 2 sturdy pieces of wood from a broken fence post as a splint. She tore strips from her own clean bedsheets for bandages. As she worked, she began to see him not just as a problem, but as a person. He was handsome in a rugged, masculine way, with a strong jawline and a mouth that, even in unconsciousness, seemed set in a firm, determined line. His hands were not the soft hands of a city gentleman, but the calloused, capable hands of a man who worked. Tucked into his wallet, which she found while checking for identification, was not a wad of cash, but a photograph of a smiling young woman and a small child, and a medical license bearing the name Dr. Samuel Thorne, Chicago. He was a doctor, and he had a family. What was he doing out here, alone in the middle of a storm? For the next 2 days, she nursed him. He drifted in and out of a feverish, delirious state, muttering fragmented, nonsensical phrases. She bathed his brow with cool water, forced sips of broth between his cracked lips, and sat with him through the long, quiet nights, watching, waiting. The silence of her home was now filled with the sound of his ragged breathing. Her solitude was broken. On the 3rd morning, she awoke in the armchair she had pulled up beside his bed to find him awake, his eyes open, watching her. They were a deep, intelligent, and startlingly clear shade of blue, and they were filled with a profound, soul-deep weariness. "Where am I?" he asked, his voice a hoarse, weak whisper. "You are in my home," she replied softly. "You had an accident. In the storm." He seemed to process this, his gaze sweeping over the simple, clean room, the whitewashed adobe walls, the colorful woven blanket that covered him. His eyes then came to rest on her face. You saved me," he said, the realization dawning. "I did what anyone would have done," she said, dismissing his gratitude. "No," he insisted, his gaze intense. "No, they wouldn't have." He tried to sit up, a sharp, agonizing pain shooting through his leg, and he fell back against the pillows with a groan. "You must rest," she said, her voice taking on a tone of gentle authority. "Your leg is badly broken. You have been very ill." He looked at her, at this strange, beautiful woman with the intense, assessing eyes and the surprisingly gentle hands who had pulled him from the brink of death. He was a man on the run, a fugitive from his own life, a man who had been betrayed by the world he knew. He had come to the desert seeking to lose himself, to disappear. He had not, under any circumstances, expected to be found. The silence that followed Samuel's weak acknowledgement of her help was thick with unspoken questions. Georgia watched him, her artist's eye noting the subtle lines of pain around his eyes, the way his jaw clenched when he thought she wasn't looking. He carried himself with the weary resignation of a man who had seen too much, a shadow lingering in the depths of his startling blue gaze. For his part, Samuel found himself strangely disarmed by her presence. He was used to the bustling efficiency of hospital wards, the crisp professionalism of nurses in starched white uniforms. Georgia was an enigma, dressed in simple, paint-splattered work clothes, her dark hair pulled back haphazardly, her face devoid of makeup. She possessed a raw, natural beauty that was both captivating and unsettling. Her movements were economical and purposeful, her gaze direct and unwavering, as if she were studying him with the same intense focus she likely applied to her canvases. Over the next few days, a fragile routine developed in the small adobe house. Georgia tended to his physical needs with a quiet, almost clinical efficiency, offering him simple meals, changing his bandages, and ensuring he remained as comfortable as possible despite the crude splint on his leg. Their interactions were sparse, punctuated by her gentle inquiries about his pain and his terse, often reluctant responses. He was a man guarded, a man who seemed to instinctively recoil from any form of intimacy, even the forced intimacy of his dependence on her. Yet in the long, silent hours, Georgia found herself observing him more closely. She noticed the way his eyes would sometimes flicker towards the small photograph on the bedside table, the smiling woman with kind eyes, and the small boy with a gap-toothed grin. A pang of something akin to pity, a feeling she rarely allowed herself, would tighten in her chest. What had separated this man from his family? What had brought him, injured and alone, to the unforgiving expanse of the New Mexico desert? One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and purple that mirrored the turbulent emotions swirling within her, Georgia brought him a bowl of warm broth. He was sitting up slightly in bed, his brow furrowed in concentration as he stared out the window at the vast, empty landscape. "You seem troubled, Doctor." "Thorne," she said softly, placing the bowl on the small table beside his bed. He startled, his gaze snapping to her face, a flicker of annoyance crossing his features at her intrusion into his thoughts. "It's nothing, Miss Keane," he replied, his voice still rough. "I find that nothing often has a way of casting long shadows," she countered gently, her artist's sensitivity attuned to the subtle nuances of his demeanor. He sighed, a weary sound that seemed to carry the weight of the world. "It's Chicago," he said finally, the word hanging heavy in the quiet room. "It feels like a lifetime ago." She waited, offering him the space to speak without pressure. After a long silence, he began to talk, the words coming slowly at first, then with a rush, as if a dam had finally broken. He told her about his life as a respected surgeon at a prominent Chicago hospital, a man dedicated to healing, a man who had poured his heart and soul into his demanding profession. He spoke of a complex and challenging surgery on a wealthy, influential patient, a surgery that had gone wrong despite his best efforts. "They blamed me," he said, his voice raw with a bitterness that surprised her. "The family had influence. The hospital board panicked. There were whispers, accusations of formal inquiry. They destroyed my reputation, Miss Keane. Overnight, the work I had dedicated my life to, gone. The trust, shattered." He looked away, his gaze fixed on the darkening sky, his jaw tight. "I left," he said simply. "I couldn't stay. The faces, the whispers, I just had to get away." He had come west seeking anonymity, a place where no one knew his name, a place where he could try to piece together the shattered fragments of his life, the storm, the accident. It had all been a cruel twist of fate, a further descent into the isolation he had sought. Georgia listened, her initial wariness replaced by a growing understanding and a profound sense of empathy. She, too, had fled a world that had felt suffocating, a world that had tried to define her. She, too, had sought refuge in the vast, uncaring beauty of the desert. "The desert has a way of stripping things bare, Dr. Thorne," she said softly, her voice resonating with a shared understanding. "It shows you what truly matters." He turned his blue eyes to her, a flicker of something akin to curiosity in their depths. "And what matters to you, Miss Keane?" She hesitated, unaccustomed to such directness, to such a personal question. She was a woman who guarded her own vulnerabilities fiercely. But something in his weary gaze, in the raw honesty of his own confession, compelled her to answer. "Freedom," she said finally, her voice quiet but firm. "The freedom to see the world as I see it, and to paint it as I feel it. Without the noise, without the judgment." He nodded slowly, a flicker of understanding passing between them. They were two people wounded by the world, seeking solace in the same stark and beautiful wilderness. In the shared silence that followed, a fragile, unspoken connection began to form, a delicate bridge built across the chasm of their individual pain. That night, Georgia found herself unable to sleep. She sat by her window, gazing out at the moonlit desert, her mind filled with Samuel's story. She thought of his lost career, his shattered trust, the family in the photograph whose faces seemed to plead for his return. He was a broken man, adrift in a world that had turned against him. And as she looked out at the vast, silent landscape, she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that her quiet solitude had been irrevocably altered. The canvas of her life now held a new, unexpected figure, a figure marked by shadows, but with the potential for healing, for connection, perhaps even for love, under the boundless expanse of the New Mexico sky. The raw honesty of Samuel's confession created a profound shift in the quiet atmosphere of the adobe house. The invisible wall between them, the one built of his guarded silence and her wary solitude, had dissolved. He was no longer just an anonymous broken man she had found in an arroyo. He was Dr. Samuel Thorne, a man of substance and sorrow, a fellow exile from a world that had betrayed him. She was no longer just a capable, if mysterious, caregiver. She was Georgia Keane, an artist who understood the language of shadows. His physical healing progressed at a slow, steady pace, a tangible timeline against which their more fragile, emotional healing could be measured. His fever subsided, and the color began to return to his face. He was still a prisoner of the bed, his splinted leg a constant, aching reminder of his vulnerability, but his mind, once clouded with delirium, was now sharp and clear. Confined to his room, Georgia became his window to the world he could not yet walk in. She would return from her long, solitary walks in the desert, her arms laden not with supplies, but with treasures. She would bring him the stark sculptural beauty of a bleached cow's skull, its empty eye sockets holding the wisdom of the vast, empty landscape. She would bring him a strangely twisted piece of juniper wood, its grain a testament to a lifetime of battling the harsh desert winds. She would bring him a single, defiant desert marigold, its vibrant orange a splash of impossible life against the muted tones of the adobe walls. She would describe the world to him, not in the plain language of a simple observer, but in the rich, sensory vocabulary of a painter. She spoke not of hills, but of the way the late afternoon sun would set the mesas on fire, turning them from deep ochre to a brilliant, bruised purple. She spoke not of the sky, but of the 1,000 different shades of blue it held, from the pale, almost white of midday to the deep velvety indigo of a moonless night. He would listen, utterly captivated. He was a man of science, a man who saw the world in terms of anatomy, of systems, of logical, observable facts. She was showing him a world he had never truly seen, a world of color, of light, of profound, emotional truth. Through her eyes, he began to see the desert not as a place of exile, but as a place of stark, breathtaking beauty. He was beginning to see the world as she saw it. One afternoon, after a long, comfortable silence, he spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "I would like to see them." Georgia looked at him, a question in her eyes. "Your paintings," he clarified. "You speak of the world with such clarity. I wish to see what it is you create from it." A wave of apprehension washed over her. Her art was the most private, most vulnerable part of herself. It was a language she had created for her own soul, a conversation she had only ever had with herself. To show her work to another person, especially to this intelligent, perceptive man, felt like standing naked before him. But she saw the genuine, respectful curiosity in his eyes. It was not the idle request of a bored patient. It was the sincere inquiry of a man who truly wanted to understand her. With a hesitant nod, she left the room and returned with one of her smaller canvases. It was a painting of a single sun-bleached cow's skull, lying in the red desert sand. But in her hands it was not an image of death. She had painted it from a low angle, making it monumental, its stark white curves set against an endless, brilliant blue sky. It was a painting about resilience, about the beautiful, enduring structure of life that remains even after life itself is gone. Samuel stared at the canvas, his expression one of deep, profound concentration. He was silent for a long time. "It is magnificent," he said finally, his voice a low murmur of awe. "I am a surgeon. I have spent my life looking at bones, but I have always seen them as a framework for flesh, a mechanical structure. You," he said, his blue eyes lifting to meet hers, "you have painted its soul." His words, his immediate and intuitive understanding of what she was trying to capture, struck her with the force of a physical blow. The critics in New York had spoken of her technique, of her use of color, of her sensual forms. But no one, not a single person, had ever looked at her work and seen its soul. In that moment, she felt a connection to him that was deeper than any she had ever known. He saw her. He truly saw her. Without a word, she left the room and returned with another canvas and then another. For the rest of the afternoon, she shared her world with him. He saw her paintings of the stark, beautiful desert flowers, of the ancient, weathered adobe churches, of the vast, empty landscapes that were so full of life. It was the most vulnerable she had ever been, and the safest she had ever felt. As he began to heal, and was finally able to move around the small house on a pair of crudely made crutches, their life settled into a quiet, domestic rhythm. They would share simple meals at her small wooden table, their conversations now easy and familiar. He would tell her stories of his life as a surgeon in the bustling chaos of Chicago, and she would tell him of her quiet, solitary life as an artist. They were two people from different universes who had discovered, to their mutual astonishment, that they spoke the same language. The house, once her fortress of solitude, now felt like a shared home. This new, fragile peace was interrupted by the arrival of a cloud of dust on the horizon. It was a motor car, a rare sight in this remote part of the country, making its way slowly up the dirt track to her house. Georgia felt a jolt of alarm. Visitors were not a part of her world. The car pulled to a stop, and a large, uniformed man with a thick mustache and a silver star pinned to his chest emerged. It was Sheriff Brody from the nearby town of Santa Fe. "Afternoon, ma'am," the sheriff said, his eyes taking in the scene with a practiced, assessing gaze. His gaze lingered on Samuel, who stood awkwardly on his crutches in the doorway. "I'm here about a car wreck, a Ford Model T, washed out in the big storm a few weeks back. Belongs to a fella from back east. You know anything about that?" "There was an accident, Sheriff," Georgia said, her voice calm, though her heart was pounding. "The driver was badly injured. I brought him here. He has been recovering." The sheriff looked at Samuel, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Is that so?" he said. "And who might you be, friend? We found a wallet near the wreck, but it had no identification in it, just a photograph." The question hung in the dry desert air. Samuel's anonymity, the very reason he had come to this empty land, was about to be shattered. Georgia could feel the walls of their quiet, healing world beginning to tremble. She had saved him from the desert, but she did not know if she could save him from the world he had been running from. The silence that followed Sheriff Brody's question was as heavy and as dry as the desert air. Samuel froze, his hand tightening on the rough wood of his crutch. He was a man who had built his life on a foundation of truth and precision. To lie now, to a man of the law, went against the very fiber of his being. But to tell the truth would be to invite the world he had fled to come crashing down upon this small, peaceful sanctuary, and upon the woman who had created it. He looked at Georgia, a silent, desperate apology in his eyes. But Georgia did not look frightened. In the face of the sheriff's blunt suspicion, a strange, calm resolve settled over her. She had spent her life observing, capturing the hidden truths of the world on her canvas. She knew how to create a convincing picture. She stepped forward slightly, placing herself between the sheriff and Samuel, a subtle but clear act of protection. She gave the sheriff a small, disarming smile, the kind of smile a respectable, slightly eccentric artist might give to an intruding official. "Forgive our lack of formal introductions, Sheriff Brody," she said, her voice a smooth, calm melody. "This is my cousin Samuel Vance. He is a writer from back east. He came out here for a sabbatical to find some inspiration in the quiet of the desert." The sheriff's gaze shifted to her, his expression still skeptical. "Vance, you say? That's not the name on the medical license we found in the wallet." Georgia did not miss a beat. "Oh, that old thing," she said with a dismissive wave of her hand. "That was from years ago. Samuel tried his hand at medicine for a while, a family expectation, you know. But his true passion was always writing. He carries it as a keepsake, a reminder of a path not taken." The lie was so smooth, so detailed, it sounded like the absolute truth. Samuel watched her, utterly astonished. She was weaving a new identity for him out of thin air, her words a masterful creative force, as powerful as any of her paintings. "He is a very private man, Sheriff," Georgia continued, her tone confidential. "That is why he came here. The noise of the city was stifling his work. I'm afraid the accident left him quite rattled, and his identification and all of his papers were washed away in the flood. We have already written to his bank in Chicago to have new ones sent." Sheriff Brody chewed on this information, his gaze moving between Georgia's calm, earnest face and Samuel's silent, pained one. He was a good man, a man who trusted his instincts. And while the story was a little too neat, he also knew Georgia Keane. She was the strange, solitary artist who kept to herself, but she was an honest woman. She was not the sort to harbor a fugitive. "All right, ma'am," he said finally, though the suspicion had not entirely left his eyes. "But this is a small town. A stranger with a broken leg and no name. It makes people nervous. I'll be back in a week or two to check in. I expect your cousin will have his new papers by then." He tipped his hat. "You have a good day now." He turned and walked back to his motor car, leaving a cloud of dust and unresolved tension in his wake. The moment his car was out of sight, a wave of delayed shock washed over Georgia. Her knees felt weak. She leaned against the adobe wall for support, a long, shuddering breath escaping her. She had just lied to a sheriff, created a false identity, and made herself an accomplice to a fugitive. Samuel looked at her, his face a mixture of awe, gratitude, and a profound, aching guilt. "You should not have done that, Georgia," he said, his voice a low, rough whisper. "You should not have risked yourself for me." "And what was I to do?" she countered, a new, fierce energy in her voice. "Let him take you away? You were injured, alone. You are a good man, Samuel. I know you are. My instincts about landscapes are rarely wrong, and my instincts about people are never wrong." He was silenced by the simple, unshakable faith in her eyes. He had been judged and condemned by his peers, by the very system he had sworn to uphold. But this woman, this stranger, had looked at him in his broken, desperate state and had seen not a disgrace, but a good man. That evening, the atmosphere in the small house was different. The shared danger, the necessary lie, had forged a new, powerful intimacy between them. They were no longer just a patient and a caregiver. They were co-conspirators, partners in a secret. As they sat in the quiet of the evening, the only light from a kerosene lamp, he finally told her the whole truth. He did not spare a single painful detail. He spoke of the patient, a powerful city alderman's son. He spoke of the rare, unforeseen complication during the surgery, a one-in-a-million event that no surgeon could have predicted. And he spoke of the true betrayal, his chief rival at the hospital, a less skilled but more politically ambitious surgeon named Dr. Alistair Finch, who had been in the operating theater with him. He explained how Finch had subtly but deliberately implied to the grieving, powerful family that Samuel had been negligent, using the tragedy to eliminate his rival and secure his own promotion. "He didn't lie, not outright," Samuel said, his voice full of a quiet, dead rage. "He simply allowed them to believe a lie. He stood by in silence while they destroyed my name. The board, terrified of a lawsuit from the alderman, needed a scapegoat. I was the one they chose. It was a political decision. He had not been struck off, not officially, but his reputation was in tatters. No hospital would hire him, no patient would trust him. He was a surgeon who could no longer operate, a healer who could no longer heal. So you see, Georgia," he said, his gaze fixed on the flickering lamplight, "the man you are sheltering is not just a man with a broken leg. He is a man whose entire life, whose very identity has been broken." She listened to his story, her heart aching with the profound injustice of it all. He had been betrayed by a world he had dedicated his life to serving. His exile in the desert was not an escape. It was a desperate search for a place where he could simply be, without the crushing weight of a reputation he did not deserve. She reached across the small table and placed her hand over his. His hand was warm, his skin calloused. It was the hand of a surgeon, a healer's hand. "That man, the one they created in Chicago, is not the man who is in this room," she said, her voice a quiet, powerful declaration. "I do not see a broken man. I see a man who is healing." He looked up at her, at the unwavering faith in her eyes, at the gentle strength in her touch. She had not offered him pity. She had offered him something far more rare and far more potent, her belief. In that moment, he knew he was in love with her. It was a love born not of passion or of romance, but of a shared, profound understanding of what it meant to be wounded by the world, and to find, in the most unlikely of places, a sanctuary for the soul. He held her hand, his grip tightening, and in the quiet heart of the desert, two solitary, healing souls became one. The aftermath of Samuel's confession was not a dramatic explosion, but a quiet, profound settling. The last secret, the last shadow that stood between them, was gone. Georgia now knew the full, painful truth of the man she had rescued, and her heart ached with a fierce, protective loyalty that felt dangerously, wonderfully like love. They were no longer just two solitary souls sharing a space. They were partners in a secret, a two-person fortress against the world. The ever-present threat of Sheriff Brody's return hung over them, a quiet countdown that lent a new urgency to their days. But instead of fear, this shared danger created a new, powerful intimacy. They were living on borrowed time, and every moment became precious. As Samuel's leg continued to heal, he graduated from his crutches to a single, sturdy cane. The house, which had been his entire world, was no longer big enough to contain his restless energy. He began to join Georgia in her studio. The conservatory, once her private sanctuary, now became their shared space. He would sit for hours in a comfortable wicker chair she had placed in a sunny corner, watching her paint. He was a silent, captivated audience. He was fascinated by her process, by the way she would stare at a blank canvas for an hour, her eyes seeing a world that was not yet there. And then, with a sudden, decisive burst of energy, she would begin. He watched as she would mix colors on her palette, a chemist of light and emotion. He saw the intense, focused passion in her eyes, the complete and utter absorption in her work. He was a man of science, who understood the world through logic and tangible evidence. She was a woman of art, who understood it through feeling and intuition. In her, he saw a different, more beautiful way of knowing the truth. She, in turn, found his presence in her studio to be a quiet, grounding comfort. He never offered empty praise. Instead, he would ask sharp, intelligent questions that pushed her to see her own work in new ways. "Why that specific shade of blue for the shadow of that rock?" he asked one afternoon, as she worked on a vast desert landscape. "The shadow itself is gray." "The shadow is not just an absence of light," she explained, not looking away from her canvas. "It is full of reflected light from the sky. It is not gray. It is alive. It is full of color, if you only know how to look." He was silent for a long moment. "You are teaching me how to look," he said softly. It was in the studio, surrounded by her vibrant, powerful canvases, that the unspoken love between them finally demanded to be named. He was watching her work on a new piece, a painting of the desert at dawn. It was a canvas brimming with a fierce, defiant hope, the dark, bruised purples of the night sky being pushed back by the brilliant, explosive golds and pinks of a new day. It was a painting about rebirth. "That is how I feel," he said, his voice a low murmur full of an emotion that made her pause, her paintbrush hovering in midair. She turned to look at him. He had risen from his chair and was standing just a few feet away, leaning on his cane, his blue eyes fixed on her with a raw, unguarded intensity. "That painting," he continued, his voice thick with feeling, "that is what you have done for me. My life was a long, dark night. I had forgotten that the sun even existed. And then I found you, or rather you found me. And you, with your quiet strength, your fierce honesty, your incredible, beautiful soul, you have brought the dawn back into my life." He took a hesitant step closer. "I am a man with no name, no reputation, no future to offer. I am a fugitive living under your roof, protected by your courage. I have nothing to give you, but I must tell you the truth." He stopped before her, his eyes shining with a love so profound it was a physical presence in the room. "I love you, Georgia Keane. I have fallen in love with you more deeply and more completely than I ever thought it was possible to love anyone." The confession, so simple and so absolute, resonated in the sunlit studio, as pure and as true as the colors on her canvas. This was the moment her own heart had been waiting for, the truth it had known for weeks. "Oh, Samuel," she whispered, setting her palette down, her hands trembling. "You say you have nothing to offer. You are wrong. You have offered me the greatest gift of all. You see my work. You see my soul. Before you, I had my solitude. But with you, for the first time, I do not feel alone." She stepped towards him, closing the last bit of distance between them. "I love you too, Samuel Thorne." He reached out, his hand gently cupping her face, his thumb stroking her cheek. He leaned down, and in the heart of her sun-drenched, paint-scented sanctuary, he kissed her. It was a kiss of breathtaking tenderness, a kiss that tasted of hope, of second chances, of a love that had been born in the unlikeliest of circumstances. It was a kiss that sealed the healing of their two broken hearts. When they finally broke apart, they clung to each other, two survivors who had found their safe harbor. But the reality of their situation remained. The threat of Sheriff Brody's return was a shadow at the edge of their newfound light. "What do we do now?" she whispered, her face buried in his chest. He held her tighter, his resolve hardening. His love for her had given him back more than just his heart. It had given him back his courage. He could no longer hide. For her, for the chance at a real life with her, he had to face the world he had run from. "Now," he said, his voice full of a new, powerful determination, "I stop being a fugitive. I cannot ask you to share a life lived in the shadows. I must go and clear my name. I do not know how long it will take, or if it is even possible. The men who betrayed me are powerful, but I have to try." He pulled back to look at her, his eyes full of a desperate, hopeful plea. "I am not asking you to come with me into that fight, but I am asking you to wait. To believe in me. Will you, Georgia? Will you give me your faith?" She looked at the man before her, no longer a broken patient, but a warrior ready to fight for his honor, for their future. Her own choice was simple, clear, and absolute. "I believe in you, Samuel Thorne," she said, her voice ringing with a conviction that was unshakable. "I will be right here waiting for you to come home." The morning of Samuel's departure was crisp and clear, the New Mexico sky a vast, indifferent canvas of blue. Georgia stood with him beside the newly repaired Model T, which a local mechanic had painstakingly restored. The small car that had been the vessel of his near demise was now to be the instrument of his return. The silence between them was not one of sadness, but of a profound, shared resolve. "You do not have to do this, Samuel," she said, her voice a quiet murmur, her heart aching at the thought of the empty house he would leave behind. "We could build a life here, a quiet one. The world outside. It does not have to matter." He turned to her, his blue eyes full of a love so deep it was a physical presence. He took her hands in his. "That is why I must do this," he said, his voice firm with a conviction she had never heard before. "The life we deserve, the life I want to build with you, cannot be one of hiding. It must be a life lived in the light, with our heads held high. I will not have you be the companion to a fugitive. You will be the wife of an honorable man. I must go back and reclaim the only thing they took from me that truly matters, my name." She knew he was right. She reached into the car and retrieved a small, canvas-wrapped parcel. It was a painting she had stayed up all night to finish. It was a small, intimate landscape of the desert at dawn, the first brilliant rays of the sun bursting over the dark mesas. "So you do not forget," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "that the sun does rise even after the longest night." He took the painting with a reverent hand. "I will not be gone long," he promised. He leaned down and gave her a long, deep kiss, a kiss that was a vow, a promise of his return. And then he was gone. The small car, a dwindling speck of dust on the long, empty road leading east. The journey back to Chicago was a strange, inverted pilgrimage. The man who had fled in disgrace now returned as a man with a mission. He was no longer running from his past. He was driving directly into its heart to confront it. He was not the same man. The profound, healing peace he had found in the desert and in Georgia's love had forged a new and unshakable core of strength within him. Chicago, when he arrived, was just as he had left it, a noisy, gray, and unforgiving city of ambition. He took a modest room in a quiet boarding house, a world away from the opulent life he had once known. His first and most crucial task was to find an ally. He knew he could not fight the entrenched power of the hospital board and the city's elite alone. He needed someone on the inside. His mind immediately went to Eleanor Vance. She had been a young, fiercely intelligent nurse in his operating theater on that fateful day, a woman whose quiet competence and integrity he had always admired. He knew she had seen the truth of what had happened, had seen the subtle professional sabotage of Dr. Finch. The question was, would she be brave enough to speak it? He found her working at a small, underfunded public clinic in a poor immigrant neighborhood, having left the politically charged atmosphere of the main hospital months after his departure. He waited for her after her shift, a tall, gaunt figure in a simple suit, a man she almost did not recognize. "Dr. Thorne," she said, her eyes wide with shock. "I need your help, Nurse Vance," he said, his voice quiet, without any preamble. Over a cup of coffee in a small, anonymous diner, he laid out his story and his plan. He was not asking her to lie or to perjure herself. He was asking her to help him find the truth, the tangible scientific evidence that would prove his innocence. Eleanor listened, her initial shock giving way to a slow, burning anger at the injustice he had suffered. She had always known he was the finest surgeon in the city. She had always suspected foul play. To help him was a great risk to her own quiet life, but her conscience would not allow her to refuse. "What do you need me to do?" she asked, her voice firm. They became a team of two, a quiet conspiracy of truth seekers. Eleanor, with her access to the hospital, became his eyes and ears. She spent her off hours in the hospital's records room, poring over the official report from the alderman's son's surgery. Samuel, from his small boarding house room, would analyze the notes she brought him, his brilliant diagnostic mind searching for the inconsistencies he knew must be there. The official report was a masterpiece of deliberate obfuscation, written by Alistair Finch himself. It was technically accurate, but it omitted key details, tiny fragments of data that, to a layman, would mean nothing, but to a surgeon, painted a very different picture. "He's buried it," Samuel muttered one evening as they worked by the light of a single lamp. "He's buried the preoperative blood analysis. It showed a rare, underlying coagulopathy, a blood clotting disorder. That is why the boy bled out. It was not my hand that slipped. It was his own body that failed him in a way no one could have predicted." "But the official report just says complications from hemorrhaging," Eleanor said, "and the original blood samples were ordered to be destroyed." "Of course they were," Samuel said, a grim look on his face. Without the samples, it was his word against the carefully constructed narrative of a powerful and respected man. For weeks, they seemed to be at a dead end. Finch, hearing whispers that Samuel was back in town, began to exert his influence. Eleanor found herself being watched at the hospital. A quiet warning was delivered to her by a nervous administrator. They were running out of time. The breakthrough came from an unexpected place. A young, idealistic lab technician, a man who had revered Dr. Thorne and had always despised the arrogant Dr. Finch, had heard rumors of their secret investigation. He approached Eleanor in a quiet hospital corridor. "I was on duty the night of the alderman's son's surgery," he whispered, his eyes darting around nervously. "Dr. Finch ordered me to destroy the blood samples, but I couldn't. It felt wrong. I kept one, a single backup slide." I labeled it as part of a different anonymous study and filed it away in the deep archive. He handed her a small, coded slip of paper. This is the archival code. It's all I can do. Be careful. Finch is a dangerous man. It was the smoking gun they had been searching for. That afternoon, Eleanor, using her authority as a senior nurse, retrieved the mislabeled slide from the deep archive. She delivered it to Samuel. He looked at the small, thin piece of glass as if it were the most precious jewel in the world. This was his vindication. This was the truth. Armed with the irrefutable scientific evidence that would clear his name, Samuel Thorne placed a call to the chairman of the hospital board. He did not make accusations or threats. He made a simple formal request. "I am requesting a full formal review of the case of the alderman's son," he said, his voice calm and steady. "I have new, conclusive physical evidence to present. I expect the entire board, including Dr. Finch, to be in attendance." The final confrontation was set. Samuel Thorne was no longer a fugitive. He was a surgeon once more, ready to step back into the operating theater of hospital politics, to excise the cancer of lies, and to finally, after a long and painful exile, reclaim his honor. He had his evidence. He had his ally. And in his pocket, he had a small, beautiful painting of a desert sunrise, a constant, vibrant reminder of the woman and the life he was fighting to return to. The hospital boardroom was a chamber of judgment, a somber, wood-paneled room where careers were made and broken. The air was thick with the scent of old money and stale cigar smoke. Seated around the massive, polished mahogany table were the city's most powerful men, bankers, industrialists, and politicians who comprised the board of directors for Chicago General Hospital. At the head of the table sat the chairman, a stern, imposing man named Mr. Harrington, and directly to his right, looking the very picture of calm, professional authority, sat Dr. Donahue Finch, his face a mask of detached concern. Samuel Thorne entered the room, a lone figure against a wall of immense power. He was not the haunted, broken man who had fled the city months ago. He was calm, his posture straight, his blue eyes clear and focused. He carried a single worn leather briefcase. In his heart, he carried the image of Georgia, a silent, powerful source of strength. He was not just fighting for his own name. He was fighting for the future he had promised her. "Dr. Thorne," Chairman Harrington began, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "This is a most unusual proceeding. The board's findings in the case of the alderman's son were conclusive. You were found to have acted with a regrettable degree of negligence. You are here today at your own insistence claiming you have new evidence. The board is listening." "Thank you, Mr. Chairman, gentlemen," Samuel began, his voice steady and respectful. He opened his briefcase and began to lay out a series of medical charts and documents on the table. "I am not here today to offer excuses or to challenge the integrity of this board. I am here to present a more complete diagnosis, not of the patient, but of the event itself." For the next hour, Samuel conducted a masterclass in surgical analysis. He did not speak of betrayal or conspiracy. He spoke only of the science. With a calm, clear, and irrefutable logic, he walked the board through the entire procedure. He used Finch's own official report, pointing out the subtle, almost invisible omissions. "Here," Samuel said, pointing to a line in the report, "the post-operative hemorrhage is noted, but the pre-operative blood clotting time, which was unusually high, is not mentioned. Here the patient's unexpected reaction to the anesthesia is documented, but the family history of coagulopathy, noted in the initial intake form, is absent from this summary." He pieced together a puzzle of deliberately omitted facts, creating a picture not of a surgeon's error, but of a patient with a rare, undiagnosed, and catastrophic blood disorder. He was not making accusations. He was simply presenting the scientific truth that had been buried in the official report. "Doctor," Finch watched, his smug composure beginning to fray at the edges. "This is pure speculation, gentlemen," Finch interjected, his voice sharp. "Dr. Thorne is creating a fantasy to excuse his own incompetence. The evidence he speaks of, The original intake forms, the initial blood samples, was all disposed of as per standard hospital protocol following the closing of an inquiry. It is his word against the official board-approved record. That is not entirely accurate, Doctor. Finch, Samuel said quietly. He reached into his briefcase and produced a small, flat wooden box. He opened it. Inside, resting on a bed of black velvet, was a single glass slide. As you know, Samuel said, his voice resonating with a new, powerful authority. It is also standard protocol to create duplicate slides for certain tests for the purposes of archival research. Through the diligent efforts of a conscientious member of our laboratory staff, one such slide from the patient's preoperative blood analysis was preserved. A wave of shock went through the room. Finch's face went pale. This slide, Samuel continued, his gaze locking onto his rival, contains the irrefutable, microscopic evidence of the rare blood cell anomaly that caused the fatal hemorrhage. It is not speculation. It is not a fantasy. It is a scientific fact. A fact that was, I can only assume, accidentally overlooked in your final report. The accusation, though politely worded, was devastating. "This is an outrage," Finch blustered, rising from his chair. "This is a fabrication. This disgraced doctor has conspired with a junior lab technician to create false evidence." "There is a very simple way to resolve this," Samuel said, his calm a stark contrast to Finch's rising panic. He turned to the chairman. "Mr. Harrington, I propose that this slide be sent immediately, under the supervision of this board, to a neutral third party. To the pathology department at Northwestern University, perhaps. Let their top hematologist analyze it and present his findings. The truth, as they say, will out. I am willing to stake my entire career on the results." Is Dr. Finch? The question hung in the air, a final, perfect checkmate. Every eye in the room turned to Donahue Finch. They saw not a confident leader, but a trapped, sweating, guilty man. His bluster deflated, his arrogance collapsed. He knew what the slide would show. He was ruined. He sank back into his chair, a broken man, and said nothing. The silence in the room was his confession. Chairman Harrington stared at Finch for a long, cold moment, his expression one of deep, profound disgust. He then turned to Samuel, his face full of a shame and regret that was absolute. "Dr. Thorne," he said, his voice heavy. "On behalf of this board and this entire hospital, I offer you our most profound and sincere apology. A terrible injustice has been done to you. An injustice that we will now publicly and completely make right." Samuel Thorne walked out of the boardroom, his honor restored. Eleanor Vance was waiting for him in the hallway, her face pale with nervous anticipation. He looked at her, and a slow, beautiful smile spread across his face, the first genuine, unburdened smile she had ever seen from him. "It's over," he said. She rushed into his arms, and he held her tightly, the solid, comforting feel of her a welcome anchor after the long, turbulent storm. The battle was won. His name was clear. That afternoon, he walked to the nearest telegraph office. He still had the small, beautiful painting of the desert sunrise in his briefcase. He took it out and looked at it, his heart full. He then penned his reply to the woman who had waited, who had believed in him, the woman who was his home. The telegram was short, but it contained his entire world. "The sun has risen. Am coming home. All my love, Samuel." The news from Chicago traveled faster than Samuel ever could. The story of Dr. Samuel Thorne's dramatic vindication and of Dr. Donahue Finch's subsequent disgraceful resignation was a sensation that was reported in newspapers from coast to coast. The quiet, solitary artist of New Mexico learned of her lover's triumph not from his own hand, but from the bold black ink of the Santa Fe New Mexican. Georgia read the article, her heart soaring with a fierce, profound pride. He had done it. The good, honorable man she knew him to be had shown his truth to the world, and the world had finally listened. In Chicago, Samuel was a man unburdened. The hospital board, in a desperate act of damage control, offered him everything. his old position as head of surgery, a public apology, a significant increase in salary. They offered him the kingdom he had lost. He met with Chairman Harrington one last time in the now familiar boardroom. He politely and firmly declined their offer. "My life as a surgeon in this city is over, Mr. Harrington," Samuel said, his voice holding no bitterness, only a quiet, peaceful finality. "I came back to reclaim my name, and you have given me that. For that, I am grateful." He stood up to leave. "My work now lies elsewhere." His old life was a closed chapter. He settled his affairs, created a generous trust fund for the loyal nurse, Eleanor Vance, and the lab technician who had saved him. And then he bought a new, sturdy automobile. He placed Georgia's small, beautiful painting of the desert sunrise on the seat beside him, a vibrant, hopeful promise of the life that was waiting for him. And then he began the long drive west. It was a journey of transformation. The man who had fled west in a cloud of shame and despair now returned in a spirit of joyful pilgrimage. The endless, open landscapes of the plains were no longer a symbol of his exile, but a beautiful open road leading him home. Back at the Adobe ranch, Georgia waited. The days were filled with a nervous, electric anticipation. Every cloud of dust on the horizon made her heart leap. She poured her feelings onto her canvas, painting with a new palette of brilliant, joyful colors. The stark, lonely landscapes of her earlier work were now infused with a palpable sense of warmth and light. She was in her studio, the late afternoon sun streaming through the large window, when she heard it. The sound of an automobile engine, steady and sure, coming up her long dirt drive. She dropped her paintbrush, her heart hammering against her ribs, and ran outside. The car came to a stop and he stepped out. He was no longer the broken, injured man she had nursed, nor the grim, determined fighter who had left for Chicago. The Samuel Thorne who stood before her was a man remade. The weary lines around his eyes were gone, replaced by a look of deep, contented peace. He was smiling, a broad, genuine, happy smile that made him look 10 years younger. She ran into his arms, and he lifted her off the ground, swinging her around in a joyous, triumphant circle. He was home. "It's over, Georgia," he murmured into her hair, holding her as if he would never let her go. "It's all over." "I know," she whispered, her voice choked with happy tears. "I read it in the papers. I am so proud of you." That evening they sat on the small porch of her adobe house, watching as the setting sun painted the desert in its familiar, breathtaking hues of orange, purple, and gold. He told her the full story of his time in Chicago, of the tense boardroom meeting, of the final, sweet victory of the truth. She, in turn, showed him the new work she had created, paintings that were no longer about solitude, but about a vibrant, hopeful world. As the first stars began to appear in the darkening twilight sky, he took her hand. "When I was in Chicago," he said, his voice a low, serious murmur, "the hospital offered me my old life back, my career, my reputation, my wealth, everything I thought I had lost." She looked at him, her heart quiet, waiting. "I realized," he continued, "that I did not want any of it, not anymore. The life I had there was built around my work. It was a good life, an honorable one, but it was incomplete. My heart was never a part of it." He turned to her, his blue eyes full of a love so profound it was a tangible thing. "My heart is here, in this desert, with you." He slid from his chair to kneel before her on the cool, earthen tiles of the porch. He took a small, simple box from his pocket. Inside was not a flashy diamond, but a beautiful handcrafted silver ring, inlaid with a single, perfect piece of turquoise, the color of a New Mexico sky. He had bought it in Santa Fe on his way back to her. "I came back a free and whole man, Georgia Keane, because of your faith in me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And I want to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of that faith. I am not offering you a life of city glamour or great wealth. I am offering you a life of quiet days, of shared work, of sunrises and sunsets. I am offering you all that I am and all that I have. Will you marry me?" Will you be my wife? Tears streamed down her face as she looked from the beautiful, perfect ring to the beautiful, perfect man kneeling before her. The solitude she had once cherished as a fortress had been transformed by his love into a shared paradise. "Yes, Samuel," she whispered, her voice ringing with a joy that seemed to echo across the vast, silent desert. 1,000 times yes. He slid the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, a symbol of the land they both loved. They were married a week later, not in a grand cathedral, but in the simple, ancient beauty of a small, whitewashed adobe mission church in a nearby village. Their only witnesses were the quiet desert landscape and the vast, benevolent sky. They returned not to a house, but to a home. It was no longer her sanctuary or his refuge. It was theirs. As they stood on the porch that evening, now as husband and wife, a gentle breeze stirred the desert poppies in her garden. He wrapped his arms around her, and they watched the moon rise over the mesas, two solitary, healing souls who had, against all odds, found their masterpiece not on a canvas or in a surgeon's theater, but in the quiet, profound, and beautiful landscape of each other's hearts. The first few years of their marriage were a quiet, beautiful masterpiece, a life they composed together, stroke by patient stroke. The small adobe ranch house, once a fortress of solitude for Georgia, was now a vibrant, loving home. Samuel, a man who had never before known the quiet rhythms of a life lived in harmony with nature, found a profound and unexpected peace in the desert. He discovered a latent talent for gardening, working alongside Georgia to cultivate a stunning oasis of color and life around their home. The ghosts of Chicago, the bitter taste of betrayal and public humiliation, had finally completely faded under the warm, healing New Mexico sun. Georgia's art flourished in the fertile ground of her happiness. Her work, once a stark and sometimes lonely exploration of form and light, was now imbued with a new and palpable warmth, a deep, quiet joy that art critics back east noted with fascinated admiration. She was no longer just a painter of landscapes. She was a painter of a world filled with love. Samuel, however, was a man of purpose, a healer by trade and by nature. While he found contentment in their quiet life, a part of him remained restless. He was a surgeon whose hands, once dedicated to mending the human body, were now occupied with mending fences and tending to soil. He had reclaimed his honor, but he had not yet reclaimed his calling. The need, when it revealed itself, was all around them. Their small, adopted community in the high desert of New Mexico, a scattered collection of Hispanic sheep farmers, Native American artisans from the nearby pueblo, and a few hardy Anglo ranchers, was a proud and resilient community, but it was also a poor one. The nearest real doctor was a day's ride away in Santa Fe, and the local curandero, while wise in the ways of traditional herbs, was no match for a serious injury or a deadly infection. The catalyst came in the form of a young boy from the pueblo, the son of a woman who sometimes helped Georgia with her weaving. The boy had fallen from a horse and sustained a deep, jagged gash in his leg. By the time they brought him to the ranch, his leg was swollen and inflamed, a telltale red line of infection creeping ominously upwards. Samuel acted without a moment's hesitation. The retired surgeon was gone, replaced by the swift, confident, and brilliant Dr. Thorne. He cleaned and stitched the wound with a skill the boy's terrified mother had never witnessed, his hands steady and sure. Using a precious, small supply of a new type of mold he had been experimenting with, a peculiar substance called penicillin he had read about in medical journals, he treated the infection. For 3 days, he and Georgia nursed the boy around the clock. And on the 4th day, the fever broke. The boy was safe. The news of the miracle performed by the artist's quiet husband spread through the community like a wildfire. Suddenly, their quiet sanctuary was no longer so quiet. A trickle, and then a steady stream, of people began to make the long journey to their ranch seeking help for ailments both minor and major. A farmer with a hand crushed in a piece of equipment, a mother whose baby was racked with a dangerous cough, an elderly man whose joints ached with a crippling arthritis. Samuel, a man who had thought his life as a healer was over, found his purpose returning to him, not in a gleaming Chicago hospital, but here, in his own sun-drenched parlor, which had been unofficially transformed into a makeshift clinic. He treated everyone, regardless of their ability to pay, accepting payment in the form of fresh vegetables, a hand-woven blanket, or a simple, heartfelt gracias. It was Georgia who saw that it was not enough. "This is not sustainable, my love," she said one evening as they cleaned up after a long, exhausting day of seeing patients. "You need a proper place, a clean, dedicated space, with the right equipment." "A clinic?" he said, a weary but hopeful light in his eyes. "Here, we do not have the funds for such a thing." "No," she said, a slow, determined smile spreading across her face. "I believe we do." The project became their shared passion, a perfect fusion of their two souls. Georgia wrote to her agent in New York. She agreed to sell a collection of 10 of her new celebrated desert paintings, a sacrifice that she made without a moment's hesitation. The sale, which caused a sensation in the art world, provided them with the capital they needed. With the funds secured, they began to build. Samuel, with his surgeon's precision, designed the medical layout of the clinic, a small but perfectly efficient space with a treatment room, a small operating theater, and a few beds for recovery. He used his contacts from his old life to order the most modern medical equipment available. Georgia, in turn, designed the building itself. She did not want it to be a cold, sterile, and intimidating institution. She designed a beautiful, low-slung adobe structure that blended seamlessly with the surrounding landscape. She insisted on large windows to let in the natural light, a quiet, protected courtyard filled with native plants where families could wait, and she painted the interior walls not a sterile white, but in the warm, calming colors of the desert itself. She hung her own paintings, images of hope and resilience, on the walls. She was creating not just a clinic, but a space for healing in every sense of the word. The community, which had already come to love them, now embraced them as their own champions. Local farmers donated their labor, helping to mix the adobe and raise the walls. The women from the pueblo, skilled in the ancient art of plastering, helped finish the interior, their hands smoothing the walls with a loving care. The Thorne Keane Clinic was not a gift bestowed upon the community. It was a project built by it. The day it opened, the entire community gathered. There were no city officials, no wealthy patrons from back east. There were just the people whose lives they had already touched, their faces full of a profound and humble gratitude. Samuel stood before them, not as a disgraced surgeon, but as their doctor. Georgia stood by his side, not as a famous artist, but as his partner. They had come to this desert as two broken, solitary exiles. But now, as they looked out at the faces of their new extended family, they were something else entirely. They were the heart of a community, the builders of a new and beautiful legacy, a testament to the fact that a life and a heart could be mended, and that the most profound healing comes when we begin to heal others. Com certeza. O legado deles começou, uma clínica construída sobre as fundações do seu amor. Agora, para o nosso capítulo final, vamos viajar no tempo para testemunhar a vida inteira que eles construíram juntos e a marca indelével que deixaram na paisagem e nos corações do seu lar no deserto. Aqui está o capítulo 10, o capítulo final de She Went to the Desert to Paint Flowers, but Found Love Healing a Broken Man's Wounds. Chapter 10. A Landscape of a Life. The years settled over the small adobe house like a soft, welcome blanket of snow. The world outside convulsed with the Great Depression and the looming shadow of another war in Europe. But in the high desert of New Mexico, Georgia Keane and Samuel Thorne cultivated a life of profound and lasting peace. Their love, born in a moment of crisis, had deepened into a quiet, unshakable companionship, as sturdy and as resilient as the ancient juniper trees that dotted the landscape. The Thorne Keane Clinic became a beacon of hope for the entire region. It grew, wing by careful wing, always designed by Georgia to harmonize with the land. always equipped by Samuel with the best medical science he could procure. It became a model of rural healthcare, renowned for its unique and powerful blend of Samuel's scientific brilliance and Georgia's compassionate, holistic approach to healing. The waiting room, filled with her vibrant, life-affirming paintings, was a testament to their belief that art and science were two sides of the same coin, both essential to the mending of the human spirit. Georgia became one of the most celebrated artists in America. Critics and collectors from New York and Paris would make the long, dusty pilgrimage to her remote ranch to see her latest work. They would try to lure her back to the city with promises of grand exhibitions and even greater fame, but she would always politely refuse. Her inspiration, her subject, her heart, it was all here, in the stark beauty of the desert and in the quiet, love-filled life she shared with her husband. Samuel, the man who had once been a fugitive from his own life, became a legend. He was simply El Doctor, a quiet, tireless servant to the scattered communities of the high desert. He delivered babies, set bones, and fought diseases, his skill matched only by his compassion. He had lost a prestigious career, but he had found his true calling, a calling defined not by fame or fortune, but by the simple, profound act of easing the suffering of others. One hot summer afternoon, nearly 20 years after Samuel had first woken up in her simple bed, a dust-covered motor car, a rare sight on their remote road, made its way to their ranch. A young man, barely in his 30s, with a sharp, intelligent face and the unmistakable air of a big city doctor, stepped out. "Dr. Thorne?" he asked, his expression a mixture of awe and reverence. "My name is Dr. Peterson. I am the new head of surgery at Chicago General." Samuel and Georgia exchanged a look, a silent acknowledgement of a ghost from a world long past. They invited the young man in for a cool drink. He told them he had sought Samuel out on his journey west. The story of Dr. Thorne's vindication and of Dr. Finch's subsequent quiet disgrace was still a cautionary tale whispered in the hospital's corridors. Dr. Peterson explained that he had studied Samuel's old surgical papers and considered him a pioneer. But he was most interested, he said, in the community clinic Samuel and his wife had built. "We are trying to establish outreach programs in the poor neighborhoods of Chicago," the young doctor explained, his voice full of idealistic passion. "But we are facing so much distrust. We build these sterile, efficient facilities and the people do not come. But here, they say you have built more than a clinic. They say you have built a community. I came here to ask you how." Samuel smiled, a slow, wise expression. He looked at Georgia, his love for her a palpable presence in the room. "It is quite simple, son," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. "You must listen more than you talk. You must treat the person, not just the ailment. And," he added, his eyes twinkling, "it helps to have a brilliant artist design your waiting room." Later that evening, after the young doctor had departed, his mind full of new ideas, Samuel and Georgia sat together on their porch, watching as the sun set, painting the mesas in their familiar, glorious hues. "Alistair Finch, you know," Samuel said quietly, using the ghost's name for the first time in years. "Dr. Peterson told me he passed away last winter, alone. His reputation never recovered." Georgia was silent for a moment, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "There is no victory in that, Samuel," she said softly. "Only sadness, for a life wasted." "I know," he said, taking her hand. "I felt no triumph, only a profound sense of gratitude. For the storm that led my car into that arroyo, for the life it led me to." He looked at her, his wife, his partner, the woman who was the very landscape of his heart. "He betrayed me and gave me a life of exile. You, my love, took that exile and turned it into a paradise." They sat in comfortable silence, watching as the first stars began to appear in the vast, darkening sky. Their life had not been the one either of them had planned. It had been forged in the crucible of loss, of betrayal, of a chance encounter in the desert. But it was a masterpiece nonetheless. a life built on the foundations of a second chance, a testament to the healing power of a quiet, enduring love. Their story was like one of Georgia's canvases, a portrait of the stark, sometimes brutal, beauty of the desert, but one that was, in the end, overwhelmingly filled with light. Sometimes the life we are forced to flee from is the one that leads us to our true home. Do not be defined by the world's betrayal, but by your own capacity for healing, both for yourself and for others. True purpose is often found not in reclaiming what was lost, but in building something new and beautiful from the broken pieces. A partnership built on mutual healing and a shared quiet purpose can create a legacy far more lasting than any fame or fortune, proving that the most beautiful landscapes are the ones we cultivate in each other's hearts.